we hardly advanced because we spoke a lot about the first paragraph on page 44. We're still talking about Kabbalah Soul.
Where are you? Which
Page 44, right column, second paragraph. ובבחינת ועשה טוב, ההיפוך הוא, היינו אינו דומה שונה פרקו 100 פעמים לשונה פרקו 100 פעמים ואחד. He says, again, he has this concept here, that for Kabbalah Soul, for accepting the yoke of heaven, you have to do opposite from your nature. So, in the previous time we learned, we saw that sur mera, to refrain from evil, the opposite in the nature of the person to refrain from evil, meaning how do you go against your nature? He says use nadarim, use vows. And today, since we don't have vows, then you have to use nikiyut. And nikiyut means that, as we discussed, that the person's subconscious is clean. That's really what it meant. And when we're talking about doing good, hayipuchu, the opposite of that, meaning going against your nature by doing good, that's what the sages say. The sages say when you learn Torah, you should repeat many times so that you don't forget what you learned.
You have to take a vow, say I'm going to learn this 100 times.
No. That's what they used to do. But
no, I'm saying to say.
But there, it's not a vow. There's a shvuah.
Yeah, I'm saying.
A vow is to prohibit yourself from something, right. And a vow is to do something proactively.
So you're not allowed to do that even for a mitzvah.
Right. Even though it says in the Torah, like I said, uvi shmoti shaveh. You should make, and we called it an oath in order to differentiate from a vow, and you should take oaths in His name. Use only Hashem's name when you take an oath. But again, the purpose of the oath was to motivate me to do something positive, whereas the vow was to prevent me from doing something prohibited.
So I can't take a vow that I'm going to be careful when I drive, or
right.
something like that.
You can't take a vow.
No.
Unfortunately, no. What do you mean? You can. The Torah even says you should, but we don't. So, what's the story here? That the natural tendency is to repeat one's learning 100 times, and here he says you should repeat the sages said you should repeat 101 times. The Alter Rebbe explains it really means that the person should go against his nature. That if your nature is to never repeat, so even repeating once is going against your nature. But if your nature was like in their time, he says, in their time, because they didn't have books, so to remember something that you had studied, meaning you had heard from some sage, you had to repeat it 100 times. That was the nature of things. Meaning if somebody heard something interesting, something important, and they wanted to commit it to memory, they couldn't say, oh, I'll buy the book. There was no books. So they repeated 100 times. They had a schedule for repeating 100 times so that they don't forget. If you repeat 101 times, that's going against the nature. The Arizal has a lot on forgetfulness. And he says that he wants to explain that even in our time, when there is no need to remember things, the 100 and 101 still have meaning. Okay?
Whoever says, and the Alter Rebbe says that you're supposed to memorize things so that when you're walking down the street, you can always be saying Torah.
So you should have a few things memorized so that you can do that, but you don't have to do that for everything. Okay? But even if you take it at face value, that the sages said there's 100 times and 101 times. So it says there, Rizal, even though we don't do that, because we don't have a need for it, because we have books. Okay? Rav Steinsaltz, whose Yortzeit was yesterday, his first Yortzeit was yesterday. It was a long day. He used to say that in our generation, since everything is online already, and he was very instrumental in getting his things online, so that all his Talmud and everything is online on Sefaria, and the whole commentary in Hebrew and in English is there, and many of the other things that he did are there. He said that the most important thing is to know where to find things, to know what to look for. Because our scholarship is different than their scholarship was. Of course, it's always impressive when you find somebody who knows everything by heart. It's wonderful to find a walking, talking Sefer Torah. It is, it's beautiful. But for most people, that's not realistic. They'll never reach that level because their memory is not built for it. And you can't develop the memory to that level. It's very hard. But you should at least be able to know what you're looking for. Meaning you should recall that there's something about this and be'erich know what to look for so that you can find it. So that really is a test today. He used to say whether a person is a real scholar of Torah. Whether they can find something within a minute. If you can't find it within a minute, so then, I don't know, dafka a minute, but in principle, if you can find it within a minute, you know it.
Yeah, Moshe Van has a very annoying habit. If you ask him where the certain halacha or whatever, he says, well, let's look it up. And he takes the right book and he opens it, and it's always at the page.
But he has to go through.
No. He opens it to the page in the halacha that he wants.
Okay.
It drives me crazy. I don't know how he does it.
Anyway, so the Arizal says it's relevant even today. And he uses this statement to teach us not to despair from learning something more than once. He says people today, their Yetzer Hara says to them, why should I learn if I learn and I forget?
That's a very good question.
People get very upset about it and they despair of learning and they stop learning because of that, because they don't remember. So it says Arizal something amazing. I think it's just beautiful. He says the first what the meaning of the sage's statement is today is that the first 100 times that you repeat something, the first 100 times you're rectifying the world of forgetfulness. There is such a world. What is the world of forgetfulness? He said the world of forgetfulness is the nukva. It's the feminine. The feminine is forgetful. Is it really forgetful? People will come and yell, my wife remembers everything I ever did since the time of creation, right? Since the 6 days of creation, she remembers everything I did wrong. We're not talking about that. That's not the feminine. The feminine is the archetype of the feminine. The archetype of the feminine is forgetfulness, while the archetype of the masculine is memory. We see it in the words in Hebrew, because zachar means to remember, literally. And Isha doesn't, it's hard to see how it's related to forgetfulness, but when you say it in the plural, nashim, that comes from the word neshiyah. Neshiyah means to forget. Yeah, it's Hebrew. It's even Tehillim.
It's real Hebrew.
Yeah. So he says the first 100 times that you learn something, the first 100 times, of course you forget because you're rectifying the world of forgetfulness. It's only the 101st time that you get into the level of the masculine. To say it another way, he says, in the first 100 times you're rectifying the nefesh, the psyche level of the soul. It's only in the 101st time that you begin to rectify the ruach. Ruach is the spirit, is the second level of the soul. Okay? So he spends a lot of time on this because he saw that in his time, because there was already books, books were around. I mean, he was in not exactly with print on demand, yeah, but there were a lot more books by the time he was around.
Reason was after Gothenburg?
1573, yeah, 1573. So
when was the first book?
1480 something. No, there were books already.
But not many.
Not many, but even in his time, you see that there was already despair from having to commit to memory. Now, it's not that before that there weren't books; there were just manuscripts. So there were few and far in between. Everything was manuscripts until Gutenberg. But by the time the Ari is around 100 years later, there's enough books that people already weary of committing things to memory. They already saw that there were books.
Does the Arizal write this?
What?
Where does the Arizal write this?
In Tzfat. What do you mean?
Where does the Arizal
Oh,
write this?
it's in the Likutei Torah. It's on last week's pasuk. Lo tishkach. You shouldn't forget what I taught you.
So you don't have the original quote of the Arizal.
Of course, I know the original.
Where?
I told you Likutei Torah.
Likutei Torah of the Arizal.
Yeah.
When you say Likutei Torah, I think of the
There's 3 Likutei Torahs that are important, very important. The one is the Arizal. The second is the Alter Rebbe. The third is Mordechai of Chernobyl. All 3 call their books Likutei Torah. It's just because it's a Likut. Okay. V'chen b'tzedakah. And same thing he says by tzedakah. Also there you have to, in your good actions, you have to break your natural tendency. So if a person is used to giving 100 shekels a day, and today he gives 101, that 1 extra shekel is worth more than the 100 that he gave. That's a big deal, what he's saying here. Okay? This is what it means to accept the yoke of heaven. And once you've done this in Shema, the Sur Mera V'aseh Tov, by changing, by going against your nature, accepting the yoke of heaven, by going against your nature and doing good and refraining from evil, then you come to loving Hashem with all of your might. Me'odecha. Ki hinei ktiv, what does it mean? אור זרוע לצדיק וזרעתי עלי בארץ, וזהו כלל שלא יוכל לשנות מיש ליש אחר אלא בביטול מהותו. Why? Because you cannot become something different than what you are unless you can annihilate your previous state, your previous existence. Every change of state requires movement through annihilation. Okay?
What do you mean when you can't change?
You can't change your nature. If your nature was to be one thing and you want to be different, then you have to go through a state of annihilation, a state of bittul.
But improving your nature is the same as destroying it?
No, it's not destroying it. See, that's where it's different than if we were talking about any kind of goyish system. So there, they would say annihilate. Meaning, if you go back to any kind of mythology in the world. So the hero who goes out to combat the dragon has to be eaten by the dragon. It's only after he's eaten and gone into his innards does he emerge a different and changed person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're not always that graphic, but the idea is the same everywhere. The idea is the same. The idea is that in the end, if you're not going through a annihilation of sorts, there's no real transformation. By Torah, this storyline, which appears everywhere around the world, because everybody knows this. It's not something unique to Torah. Is not called annihilation. It's called bittul, nullification. And nullification doesn't have to happen, meaning it's already sublimated. When you say annihilated, so people understand, well, maybe you need to make a sacrifice. I mean, that's the real content of the story of the binding of Isaac. The meaning today, I mean, in 100 years, there's more advanced meanings also. But the meaning from the beginning was, from the very origins of Yiddishkeit, was that we don't need to annihilate the sun in order to become something new. Meaning we don't have to give something up entirely, kill it, for us to go through a transformation. Avram goes through the transformation without killing Isaac. He has to be willing to, but he doesn't have to. Meaning, in other words, the Torah is saying Avram went through a state of nullification before Hashem. He didn't have to actually annihilate his son. He didn't have to sacrifice it. But he had to go through the experience. By going through the experience, Atayadati ke'ere Elokim ata. Then he emerges on the other side, not just as Abraham who loves God, he emerges as Abraham who fears God. He went through a transformation, real transformation, but he didn't have to go through annihilation. The same thing is here, that you only have to go through nullification. You don't have to go through annihilation. You don't have to kill the old in order to come to the new. That's why in Yiddishkeit, there is no need to kill one's parents. By the Goyim, it's a rite of passage.
Kill your parents?
Yeah, you can't become who you were destined to be until your parents either die or you kill them, one or the other. You have to inherit their place. We don't inherit our parents' place to become who we are. We don't need that. You don't have to wait. A Jew doesn't wait until his parents die, until he claims his stake in the world. He can do it side by side. Why? So the deep reason is because the real parent is Hashem. The parent who's here in the world is not the one who gives or doesn't give you your legitimacy for existence. So that as long as he's alive, you're dependent on him and you can't really stake your own claim. Okay? In Yiddishkeit, Hashem gives you your legitimacy. Hashem is your real father. And because Hashem is your real father, so your father can, Baruch Hashem, be alive for 150 years, no problem. And your grandfather also. And that doesn't take anything away from your own purpose in this world. There's many things that are different because Yiddishkeit is already, it's already sublimated. It's already made all the leaps in the psychology that you need to make in order to live a normal life and not to have to. By the Goyim, this is still true. This hasn't changed. That's why they have this whole thing of generations, right? The people born from 1895 to 1920, I don't know, they call them the lost generation. Then from 1920 to 1930, the ones who were born from 1920 or 1915 to 1930, they were called the greatest generation because they're the ones who fought in World War II. Right? If you were born between 1920 and 1930, or 1915, 1930, you were in World War II. Then there was a baby after the war. I don't remember what they called the ones who were born until 45. And then from 45 till 65, they called it the baby boomers. Then from 65 to, I don't know, 79, that's when I was born, it's called Generation X. And then you had millennials. Everybody was born from or maybe I'm missing one. Then millennials. Then Generation Z. And now they have they call it now Generation Alpha. I don't know, whatever. What's this whole mishigas with generations? You've never heard this. You're not watching enough. You're not reading enough popular culture. Anyway,
I've heard about the baby boom. That's it.
Okay, so now the alphas or the millennials, their bad word is boomer. When they say to somebody, you're a boomer, you were born between 1945 and 1965. So you're a boomer. And when somebody says, hey, boomer, that's like saying a bad word. It's a derogatory term. Why? Because of the generational gap. Now look at Yiddishkeit. It's exactly the opposite. Where do you find? Yesterday I was at Reb Steinsaltz's at his grave, and later we had a big Verbrengen. What was the average age of the people at the Tzion, at the grave, and what was the average age of the people at the Verbrengen? 30, I'd say, maybe even 25. How is that even possible? Where do you see that in the non-Jewish world? Hundreds of, well, there were some teenagers, but not very many, because they already didn't really know him that much, but there were some who came. most of the people were in their 20s, some of the people in the 30s, and I was already, the geriatric ward, sitting with all the people with the white beards, the mechubadim. How is that possible? Because there's no generational gap in Yiddishkeit. Because Torah cancels that out, because it's exactly the opposite. That we see that the elders are close to us. We're not, and same thing with our parents. The respect for them is not just because Hashem said to respect them. It's because we don't compete with them. I'm not in competition with Rav Steinsaltz. Nobody was in competition with him. Nobody waited for him to pass away so that they could start their lives. Nobody waited for him to pass away so that they could stake their claim in the world. There was no such thing. What everybody feels that they lost a mentor. They lost somebody. A mentor is a bad word, because a mentor is like, you have to wait for him to die in order to take his place. But really, we lost somebody who was a guide and who was an inspiration. He was an inspiration, basically. So it's a whole different understanding. So anyway, this is called Ol Zaru Al Tzaddik Uzrati Ali Ba'aretz, which means not annihilation, but nullification. The nullification is in the psyche. The nullification is not physical. It doesn't have to happen as something physical. And the world theme of this is that you plant something in the earth and it has to rot in order to be born again as many, right? So you put one seed in and you get a lot back. When you put a seed of wheat, you get many bushels back. כך הוא ממש בנמשל, כשמבטל רצונו ויתקף לסדרך, אז יוכל לבוא לבחינת ואהבת בכל מאודיך, בחינת אהבה גדולה שאינה יכולה להתקבל בכלי. And so by doing this, by doing the accepting the yoke of heaven, going against our nature, that's the nullification. What we get back in return, what grows back out of this nullification, out of this planting of ourselves, as it were, in the ground and transforming ourselves, is tremendous love of Hashem with all your might, which could never happen. And with all your might really means with all of your nature. It's only my whole proclivity, my whole innate nature becomes dedicated to God. When it says b'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul, that's the love that's in the mind. שהוא בחינת כלי. אבל בחינת ובכל מאודיך לא היה בשום כלי, אלא הכלי שלה הוא מלכות פה ותורה שבעל פה קרינן לה, ונקרא מצוות המלך, אסור מותר, טמא וטהור, כשר ופסול, ומתנית וכולו. So, when the first part of, and you shall love Hashem with all of your soul, בכל לבבך, בכל נפשך, sorry, second part, with all of your soul is still in the mind. First, בכל לבבך is in the heart. Then with your mind. What's mechol meodecha? Mechol meodecha is with the keter. It's what's beyond. Okay? The famous verse about the Mashiach in Isaiah. Hinei yaskil avdi, yarum venisa vegava meod. There's many essays by the Rebbe on this verse. And he says there's chamesh aliyot shel Mashiach. The 5, call it elevations of the Mashiach. What does it mean? Hinei yaskil avdi. He should be, yaskil means successful. He'll be successful. Ve'yarum, he shall rise. Ve'nisa, and be exalted. Ve'gava, and will be high. Me'od, me'od is the 5th. As me'od just means much, or very. Me'od means the keter, the 5th. It's always the 5th. It's going beyond the mind. It's going, okay. So we said that. And this is what's called Lo haya b'shum kli. This me'odecha was never in a vessel. Ela kli shela hu malchut peh. The only vessel it has is kingdom itself. V'torah shebe'al peh krenin. And that's the oral Torah, the oral tradition. V'nikra mitzvat hamelech, asur mutar tameh v'torah kasher v'pasul v'matnita v'chulu. And this means coming to a state of connecting with the oral Torah, meaning that the person himself speaks Torah. We have to end.
I have a story for you.
Okay.
Quick story.
Yeah.
Probably heard it. Story of Moshe Feinstein on the plane.
I don't remember.
Moshe Feinstein came to Israel once or something.
Yeah.
He was here for one day. And he was flying back from Tel Aviv to New York, sitting in first class. And the person next to him in first class, or close to him, because they don't sit next to each other, was the head of the Histaklut.
Dulcin.
It was a long time ago. I don't remember which one it was.
Probably that one.
So, every 15, 20 minutes, somebody knocked on the door of the first class compartment. A young lady, 18, 19, and she said, Moshe, are you okay? You need anything? Something missing? You want something? No, fine. And the whole flight, this young lady is knocking on the door saying, so after 8 hours, this guy says, tell me, who's this lady who keeps coming and asking you all the time? So he says, my granddaughter. Is your granddaughter?
She talks
What
to you?
an amazing coincidence. How come she's on the same flight as you? So he says, no, he says, one granddaughter flew with me to Israel, and this granddaughter lives in Israel, and she's flying me back home to look after me. He says, wow, he says, that's amazing. He says, you know, I have loads of grandchildren. I see them twice a year. Later Seder, and after the Yom Kippur fast. It's the only time we ever see each other. He says, how come you're in such contact with your grandchildren? So Moshe said to me, it's very, very simple. He says, in our world, when a grandchild looks at his father, or his grandfather, he says, that's somebody who is 1 step or 2 steps closer to Moshe Rabbeinu. So I have to give him very great kavod. He says, you look at someone, he says, that's 1 step closer to a chimpanzee. Why do you have to give him any kavod? But that's exactly what you're saying. You know, what the previous generation is someone to look up to.
Shkoich. Very pertinent.